Welcome back to another Tricky Thursday. I'm your girl Trisha, owner of Creative Costume Academy, where it is my mission to share my love of pattern making with you so you can start doing and making your own patterns in an easy and fun way and start making those garments that you love right away. Today, I want to continue our conversation that we've been kind of having all month about tracing off your patterns or how you get started and getting ready to make adjustments, design adjustments, or just getting ready for your mock-up and making sure that it fits you the way that you want it to fit, at least close, before you even get up to the mock-up stage. So we've traced off our patterns at this point. We've blended sizes if you needed to blend sizes. And now what we're getting into is we really want to measure again, knowing where those seam allowances are, where the actual seam line is, and measuring those patterns together, how you do that, where you do that, and what do you do if you need to add or take away a little bit at this point. So that's what we're talking about and focusing on today, is making little bits of a sizing adjustment before you get too into the mock-up while you're still kind of in the tracing off pattern phase. And then once you've made your little sizing adjustments, if you need to, if you don't, great, move on. And if you're wondering about what I'm talking about, tracing off, blending sizes, go visit my earlier Tricky Thursdays where I talk about that. And once you've made those little sizing adjustments, if you want to learn more about how to turn a basic pattern into maybe a design you see in a sketch or design you see on the runway, that is where the pattern making skills come in. We can learn the foundational principles and then take it even further. And lucky for you, we have a whole new academy starting up as soon as a couple of days. So by the time you watch this, it may already be open. You can go and check out Pattern Making Academy, where we will help you take any design that you have seen or in your head and apply it to either a pattern that you've purchased, a sloper that you buy, and so take those designs and running with. So that is just about to come out. So if you are to this point and you want to learn more, be sure to check out Pattern Making Academy. The info for that will be in my bio. But let's dive in and make a few small adjustments. And if you want to know more, take it even farther, come visit us at PMA. So let's go over the table and dive back into this pattern and get us ready for a mock-up. So after you have traced off your pattern pieces, so I have a front here, and this is the front and this is the back, and I have already added my extra seam allowance. You can see that in my previous Tricky Thursday videos how and why I did that. If you haven't already done this before you trace off the pattern, I highly suggest that you do this now. And what I'm talking about is measuring your three basic areas, your bust, waist, hip, and making some initial sizing adjustments. And even if you did the splitting, you figured out the size on the back of your envelope and figured out that you're one size up top and another size down here in the bottom, that's fine too. And you've traced it off. There is on some patterns finished garment measurements, and that will also help you with this step. But I just always, because I wasn't used to using finished garment measurements, I always measure my pattern. Now to do this, you want to not only know those measurements, bust, waist, and hips, you also want to know what amount of ease that you like to have in your patterns. And depending on the style that you're wearing. So that's something that we're not going to get too into today, but you want to know, like, if you're a 36 bust, but you really like 2 inches of ease, what you want to measure in the waist or the bust area is 38 inches for your finished garment. And I'm going to show you how to do that, so on and so forth. So including that ease into the measurement when you're measuring these areas. And I do have other Tricky Thursdays about ease and also about making sizing adjustments. So I'm just going to breeze through this because I feel like this is something that is really important and I want to show how to do this. So I've already added my seam allowance, but I suggest if you're going to do this part and you haven't done it up to this point, to not cut out your patterns just yet. Notice they're still on the paper, and that's so that when I do this, and if I do want to make sizing adjustments, that I still have paper to kind of move those lines around a little bit. So here's what I'm talking about, and maybe I'm going to have this go to the side so you can see a little bit clearer. So the reason that we copy this, and you can go back to that earlier Tricky Thursday, but this line that is not the seam allowance line. This seam allowance line, that's where you're going to cut your fabric so that when you sew it under your machine, you're going to sew it 1 inch away at your stitching line. So this line that we're trying to find when we're drawing out our measurement is our stitching line. And that's important because when you sew these pieces together, that will tell us the true measurement of what this is. So when you're checking measurements, like bust area is one that you want to check. And I can tell because both of these darts are pointing into where the bust point should be. So if I kind of connected them, that's where my bust point, the highest point of my bust should be. So that's my bust level, let's say. Now this one's a little tricky because we've got this dart, and I could go ahead and close that dart, but I can also kind of go with the bottom. What I'm doing is I'm lining up my side seams on the stitching line, not the seam allowance line. And you can see, like, I'm lining this line up with this line, and I can see, you guys probably can't see as clearly in the camera, but they are now on top of each other. They don't line up all the way because there's a curve down here, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I want these to be touching because this is the area that I want to measure. So once I've got those touching, you can do a couple of things. You can put a weight down. Sometimes what I like to do is you can tape it in place. I sometimes will just throw a pin in there so that it doesn't wiggle around and separate and move on you. But you want to know your bust measurement and then what you want to add for ease, like I just talked about. Then what I want to do is, and notice how this kind of curves, right? I want to follow with my measuring tape and have it kind of curve around as it goes, and then go to your center back line. If this center back had seam allowance on it, I would still go to the stitching line. So notice this is on fold and this is on fold. This isn't even a pattern that really goes together, but I'm just using it as an example. But you measure in that area, then this is only half of the body. So I can then fold my measuring tape and get to, I've got 41 inches. So if I had, let's say, a 36-inch inseam, I can see visually that's how much, or excuse me, if I had a 36-inch bust, I can see that that is going to be a lot of ease. So I may want to take some of that out. But if I had a 38 or a 39-inch bust, that's about 2¼ inches of ease. So that might be the perfect amount of ease. So I'm going to talk about what happens if that's too much ease or it's not enough. Like say you're a 40 bust and you're worried that 41¼ inches is not going to be enough. We'll talk about that in a second. I just want to show you measuring the waist and the hips before we talk about adjusting here. So this is a really important step. Even if you have those patterns that give you the finished garment measurements, or you've cut out or traced off the size that your body measurement said to cut out, there still might be more ease included in these patterns than works for your body, or not enough. So if you know how much ease you generally like, it's really kind of handy to do this, and you can kind of make adjustments before you end up with a huge garment or one that's a little too tight. But you are going to make a mock-up and you do have extra seam allowance. But we'll continue with this. So if I'm going to measure my waist, this pattern has a notch here at the waist and a notch over here. So that makes it really handy. I know where that waist is, but it's also, notice it's most indented there because that's generally indicating that's the waist. So I'm going to put this line on top of this line, not my seam allowance line, this line. And then I am not worried about it lining up above there. I'm not worried about it lining up below there. I'm just going to pin it right there. And then this level going across here and going to here is my waistline. Now I do have these darts. Now you can close those darts and make this measuring process really easy. So you can pin them closed because they will be sewn closed if you follow the pattern directions to create that shaping there. So when I'm measuring this waist, I don't want to include those darts. So you can either pin them closed while you're measuring, that makes it really easy, or you can do it this way. If I start my measuring tape here, when I get to that dart, I'm going to hold that with my finger and I'm going to jump over to the other dart as if it's sewn closed and it's not there. And then I can continue measuring and do the same thing here. I can hold it right there where my dart lake is and then jump over to the other side and continue measuring. So that gives me a waist measurement here. I unfold that because that's only half of the body, and gives me a waist measurement of 33⅕. And depending on what your waist measurement is, do you need more or less, or is it right there and you need to add a little bit more to include the ease? That is what you need to be asking yourself. And then we'll just do a quick hip measurement, but basically it's the same thing. So for each measurement, I'm just showing you, you have to reposition the pattern because this isn't fabric, it's paper. And so when I'm lining up my hip area, I'm going from this line to this line, and I'm going to reposition it and pin it in place to do my hip measurement. And again, I am going to go across here. I'm going to jump over this dart because that dart is there before I continue, and jump over this dart to the other side and get my hip measurement. And then this one is measuring 41.5. Is that close to my measurement? Do I need to add or subtract? So I wanted to show you that quickly. Now, don't worry. This is why you're doing this. If something doesn't match up, if you need to add a little bit or take away a little bit, that's why you're doing this step. Much easier to do in paper than it is in fabric. So I do have a whole Tricky Thursday on increasing and decreasing sizes, but I'm going to go over it really quick here. But if you need a little bit more instruction, I encourage you to look at my other Tricky Thursdays on increasing and decreasing size. So let's say I need to add 2 inches to my bust area in total circumference. If I need to add 2 inches, so here's 2 inches, I need to know there's 2 side seams. So I can add to both side seam to get me to that additional 2 inches that I want to add. And I usually make little notes. I want to add 2 inches to the bust, nothing at the waist, and 1 inch at the hips, whatever you're going to do, or vice versa, taking it off. Once you know what you need to add or take away, you want to take that measurement and you want to divide it into fourths, because this is half of the body. So I have one side seam, another side seam, and then I'm going to have the same on the other side. I'm going to have the other side seam and the other side seam. So that's 4 positions. If I add it in these 2 spots, it will increase the size. So for 2 inches, I'm going to fold it in half. That gets me 1. And then half of 1 inch is half of an inch. So if I add half of an inch, I'm just going to do this quickly. You can see that I went ahead and closed the dart in the front to make it easier. So I added a 1/2 inch. I drew a 1/2 inch line coming down from the underarm to the bust area, because that's where I want to add that extra measurement. And then what I would do is, if I'm not adding anything to the waist, if I'm adding more in the waist, then you do the same in the waist. But if you're not adding anything to the waist and you only want to increase the bust, you can have that line go back to your waistline. And what happens is that new line that you just drew becomes your stitching line. And this is why I suggest to trace off your patterns in pencil, so you can just erase that previous line. You would do the same thing over here and go to 0, I call it, at your waist, and that has now added 4 inches in that bust area. And by erasing this, now you see that now I only have 1/2 inch of seam allowance here, so I would want to erase that as well, which is why I say it's better to make these adjustments before you add in your seam allowance. But if it's already added, you just add the 1 inch back on now to the bust area, and now you still have 1 inch seam allowance to do your initial mock-up, but you've made your bust bigger as well. And you can do the same thing going the other way. If I had to make my hip 2 inches smaller, now I'm just giving you guys examples, not going off any real measurements. So whatever your measurements are, but since we've already figured out what 2 inches is divided by 4, so if I'm going to have the hips come in 2 inches, and you can do this at the bust, you can do this at the waist, same thing. I would come in a 1/2 of an inch from the stitching line, both on my front and my back. And then if I'm not changing anything in the waist, I would go up to 0 and maybe keep some of that curve in there. And then I would erase that original line and draw in my new seam allowance. So I'm staying with the 1 inch just for now. If you want to go down to 5/8 or whatever at that point. So super easy to make those adjustments at this point with that extra paper included. So I hope that you found this helpful and you're not afraid to try a little bit. I'm doing this quick because I'm going to do a mock-up and I'm going to see what actually needs to be done on the body. But this is a really easy way to just make sure that it measures what you want it to measure, at least really, really close. And if not, you can make these simple adjustments really quickly. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.